All right, I'm going to get started then. My name is Carrie Winninger, and I am the Educational Outreach Lead with the Center for Environmental Inquiry, CEI, at Sonoma State University, and I'm your host today. So do let me know if there's anything you need or if anything comes up, just put something in the chat. It could be to everyone or it could be a private chat to me. CEI public events are usually held in person at either our Sonoma Mountain Preserve, Fairfield Osborne Preserve, or our Mendocino location, which is the Galbraith Wildlands Preserve. We have over 4,500 acres of land set aside for research, education, and stewardship. But we do have events like this today that are virtual. Thank you, pandemic, for showing us that this is possible and actually still what some people want to do instead of come up to our lands on a rainy day like today. So we do want to acknowledge before anything else that our main campus and all of our preserves are currently ancestral lands of Native peoples, and we would like you to come learn more about that at cei.sonoma.edu. We're really excited to help you connect to nature and learn how you can make a difference. So first things first, if I could have everybody please type your full name and affiliation, if possible, into the chat box. It's really helpful for me to know who's here today. It's our sign-in sheet. So please do type your name into the chat. Thank you very much. Before the presentation, let me just quickly tell you a little bit about what the Center for Environmental Inquiry is and how we can be a resource to you. The center manages all of these lands, as I'm saying, and it mobilizes faculty, students, and community to solve complex environmental challenges. We like to think we are turning education into action. So we really invite you to join this diverse community of learners, of problem solvers, all across backgrounds, all across disciplines in the university and beyond, because we truly believe that all sectors of society and parts of the community have to get involved if we're going to be successful at tackling environmental challenges in this modern day. Let me just admit a couple other people here. Wonderful. So what we want you to do today is leave with a better understanding of our connection with the environment and actual skills that lead to sustainable solutions. There's many ways you can get involved with us after this event. You can engage in research, take our training programs for naturalists or land managers, learn about the virtual field collaboration for undergraduate classes. That's particularly interesting if you're a faculty member. We have internships and student jobs. We have data you can access. You can lead events like these if you have something to share with the community, partner with us on projects, or help more programs like this by donating, since they are completely funded by generous support of donors. And do come to our Saturday hikes. They are starting March 25th, so that's this weekend. You'll be able to come up to our preserve every Saturday at 10 a.m. Thank you so much for joining today. I hope everyone's now actually here. Please just know that each of you does have a role to play, and I hope you will choose to get environmentally ready with us so we can tackle the greatest environmental challenges in history. Today, we are going to hear from Stephen Swain, the environmental horticulture advisor for UC Cooperative Extension, Marin County, and he has a lot to say. So he actually has about an hour of presentation material. Of course, leave if you need to, and we will try and wrap up right around about 2 o'clock, but it means we won't have too many time for questions. So feel free, he has said it's okay to email him afterwards with any questions, or email me and I'll pass them along. We really want to make sure those get covered as well, but just might not have time today. So I'm going to go ahead and put my email in the chat. As a reminder, we've turned your sound off, so please do keep yourself muted, but it's totally fine to leave your videos on. And lastly, for those who just entered, please put your name and affiliation in the chat. That's our sign-in sheet, and email me, or sorry, chat to me if you have any questions or concerns during the event. With that, I'll let Stephen take it away.
Okay, share screen. Here we go. Share. Okay. Does this look right to everybody? Good. Okay, sounds good. So talk today is landscaping for climate change, which is a really, really big topic. I didn't quite, it's hard to figure out what to fit in or what not to. So that's why we're so long today. I'll try and keep it short. If I can get this to please change. There we go. So as everybody knows, we have 2 seasons in California, the fire season and the flood season. This has been a pretty good flood season so far. And And so what we're wondering here is a little bit of what to do with all the water, especially in the future. And it's a little late for actually getting anything done for this year, although the ground's nice and soft for digging. But we'll talk about what rain gardens can do for us and things like that. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about fire. And they always say it'll be a bad fire year. If it's a big rain year like this, they say it's because of all the plants growing. And then if it's a drought year, it's because everything's too dry. So I don't know how to deal with that. That's a little bit like trying to predict the weather. They said this was going to be a warm, dry winter too. So I think what we're going to focus on is putting the right plants in the right place so that when, whether it's fire or rain that we're facing, we can try and have a landscape that doesn't flood and doesn't burn. We will also be looking at pollinators and wildlife, and mostly from the very selfish perspective of how they can help us maintain a healthy, vibrant landscape with as little effort as possible, and that what happens to work for them too. Okay, come on, why is it not? There we go. So as you are probably very aware, water is a limited resource in California. Landscape water can account for somewhere around 50 to 70% of home use. Even houses that have very efficient landscape irrigation needs tend to use about 30% of their water for it. The Sonoma County population is projected to increase to by 54% from the 2010 levels by the year 2050. Water use was projected in 2011 to outpace supply by 2020. That was 3 years ago. And I think that's been the case. The problem of being that California's supply is kind of erratic. So exactly what we call supply is depends on the year. Clearly, I don't think we outpaced it this year yet. But conservation is essentially here to stay. That's because even in a year like this year, a lot of the extra water is simply running off the landscape. And then we have to rely on what little we have stored. And that means that we're going to be here. Conservation is here to stay. For every year is going to essentially be a drought year from here on out, from the perspective of summer water use. And of course, water is energy. A quarter of all of California's power goes to pumping water, whether it's from over the Grapevine into Los Angeles, from Inyo County, or from the Eel River into the Russian River so that we can fill up Lake Sonoma and have water in Sonoma County. And Marin is no different. So water essentially is energy, and there's a lot of it going into wells too. So part of this feeds back into that whole thing. Energy is basically a carbon footprint because we're still mostly a carbon-based energy users. And that means that we're contributing to the problems that we're experiencing by simply using water. So it's good to help reduce our water use. Okay, so let's talk about water quality and the easy stuff. The easy stuff is tap water is really underappreciated in California. I'm amazed at the number of people that buy bottled water, and I'm not judging anybody for doing it. I have bought bottled water too when I need a quick bottle to grab with me and I forgot to bring something that carries it. But tap water is drinking quality water. In fact, a lot of bottled water is simply good quality tap water that they ran through another filter and put it in a bottle. And when it's used for irrigation, it's kind of sad, actually, because we're spending a lot of energy and effort cleaning this water up to make sure it's drinking great. And then we use it for watering our lawns when the lawns would be really happy with just straight well water in most cases. So there's a lot of hidden costs there. Speaking of carbon footprints, watering your lawn has a pretty good sized carbon footprint. One of the reasons we want to conserve water, and I'm not railing against lawns. Lawns have a place in it. Okay, so that's tap water. And I wish I had tap water. I don't. You only really get to appreciate tap water when you live on less than stellar well water like me. So well water is a little bit of the Wild West. You get whatever it is you manage to wrangle out of it. And that means you probably want to test your well water. And well water has problems. The groundwater levels have been dropping in California for decades now. And that's going to be increasing costs. Now, it's not so bad in the Santa Rosa Valley, but it's very bad in the this California Central Valley. That means you're pumping more and more and more every year paying more and more every year to pump groundwater. But there's some good sides to well water. It's not super treated when it comes right up out of the well. So we're not spending a lot of time treating something that you just use for irrigation, but it's also not treated. So therefore, the question is it potable? And in a lot of cases, it is, and in some cases, it's not. And then there are salt issues. That's not, again, a really big problem unless you live near the coast in an area like the Salinas Valley where there's saltwater intrusion, and then you may not be able to get anything decent at all. Finally, there's increased regulation going in with well water. And that is, they've started billing all of us who live on wells for simply having a well now. And I imagine their day isn't too far off when we can expect to see water meters going in on our wells to see just who's using what, in the name of equity. Okay, so well water. This is what, and we often take for granted that we have really good water, and that we complain about the quality of our tap water when our tap water is really way better than it often has to be to get by. So what do we do to help us get by with in living in a summer dry situation? Well, one is rain gardens. So what do these help with us? These help with a number of things. First of all, they are a method of groundwater recharge for a lot of places. So what this means is, instead of piping it directly to the sewer, and we've all seen the sewer grates that say no dumping, flows to bay or flows to the ocean. Instead of having it flow to the bay, we put it in something that looks like this. And this is because we want that first rain of the year to go into a biological swale like this. And this is a rain garden. It's just bioswale is a fancy name for one. And it serves a slightly different function in certain regards, but for the most part, it's the same thing. In this case, it's a street that's the water's being dumped from the street and a parking area into this swale. And that means that all the pollutants, the tire dust, the oil, when the first rain comes, that all gets washed into the soil instead of washed into our creeks. And in the soil, it can be decontaminated because there are a lot of critters that live in the soil, namely fungi and bacteria, that can break down a lot of these fairly complex molecules. And pollutants is a pretty broad term. So it's not just oil and tire dust. It also includes very natural things like bird poop, which lands on our roofs. And that's another thing that rain gardens are good for. A rain garden like this will be this is a fire station in Nevada. Water will run off the roof and the birds have pooped up there and the water gets washed in here. And we don't want that in the creeks either. We want that to have a chance to fertilize the gardens and get taken up by the soil. And all of this ends up running into a small retention pond. And at this time of year, probably today, it's full of water. The beautiful thing is that the plants use a lot of the breakdown products. And so the water gets purified through this. Now, the problem with them is that they require maintenance. And this has been a problem that many cities have found. They spend a lot of money dedicated to designing a really nice bioswale, some of these really nice rain gardens. And then they figure we'll figure out how to pay for the maintenance later on. And they don't realize just how big the maintenance task is. But weeds love to grow in seasonal wetlands. So maintenance can be a real problem. And you've got to really plan for that ahead of time. And one of the things we can do is we can plant the heck out of these things with lots and lots of natives, but it can take a couple of years for those natives to get established and really fill in all the cracks. And that's where the weed control really becomes paramount importance, because once the weeds get in, it's really much harder to take them out because you can have a 30-year seed bank from things like brooms getting into your rain gardens. So one of the other great things about using natives and rain gardens is that these little wetlands, seasonal wetlands, are a lot of what's been developed. So there are things like this. This is a Sebastopol meadowfoam, and this is an endangered species, and it really only grows in Sebastopol, Cotati, and a little patch out near Napa. Those are the three last remaining. This doesn't grow anywhere in San Francisco, anywhere in Santa Cruz, nowhere in Mendocino. These are the last remaining bits of it, and it grows beautifully in summer dry, winter. And what it doesn't like is grazing, and it doesn't like mowing. So it's not really something that's going to be found in your lawn, and it's not really something that's going to be found in cow pastures either. So this really limits it. So anyway, you can find some real treasures like this that can grow, that will thrive in your garden. Whether you can buy them commercially gets to be a little bit more of a challenge, but I think it's kind of cool that these things exist still. So when I said that was the easy stuff, you know, those are the drinking water and the well water. And there are a lot of infrastructure and bits and pieces around to help you with those things, namely city water, sewer systems, septic systems. A lot of people know how to do this stuff. The harder stuff gets to where we get into things like recycled water, which isn't so hard. It depends. If we're talking about a gray water system, it isn't so hard. If we're talking about water treatment plants, it's way more than a person can really handle. Or we're talking about harvesting water, and that gets into all kinds of problems, especially if you want to make it potable water. So there's issues with maintenance and contaminants with these. I'm going to go fairly quickly through them. So one is, especially for gray water systems, you really can't use sprinklers very effectively or drip systems very effectively with them. And the problem being that if you've got a gray water system, you've got a pump that comes from the washing machine, but it has to be able to take pressurization. And usually that's not how your washing machine's set up, is to pump against a pressure gradient. So you're going to need another pump if you're going to use sprinklers with it. And the sprinklers can get clogged with stuff from your laundry or stuff from your shower. Similarly, if you use a drip system, drip emitters will get clogged. So now you've got all kinds of fun things to do with trying to filter that water that you're going to use for your gray water. So that's not how most gray water systems are built. And we'll get into looking at a gray water system just a little bit later. And we'll talk about some of the issues, the other one being salt. And that's what builds up in gray water, regardless of whether it's institutional recycled water like you get from your water district in those purple pipes, or it's your own gray water system. All of them have salts that it just becomes economically unviable to remove all the salts out of it. So you have slightly salty water. And if you can get it to an area where that water your land can be leached effectively, and this is a good year for that, it's not a problem. But if successive years of drought can lead to salt buildups in your soil, and that can be problematic over the long haul, especially on clay soils. Once they fill up with salts, then they can be really hard to leach. So then we have other questions. So that's recycled water, just very briefly. Then there's harvested water. So this is harvesting. So what you're looking at is a cistern that's several hundred gallons, and it's attached to a solar system. So this is nice. This is a system that was set up in Sonoma County off Mark West Road, and it's got solar panels, and the solar panels act as a rain catchment in the winter, and they give us both rain and sun. The problem with this is that things get onto those solar panels, pine needles and leaves and dust from construction projects on nearby, and there's roads nearby too, so dust from roads, and this all lands on the solar panels, and so we still have a first flush issue, and we don't want all those contaminants necessarily ending up in the tank. So that's what that funny little J thing is that maybe it's not a J, well, it's sort of an upside down J, that funny little protrusion we have off the bottom. So what the idea is that the water runs into a gutter that is covered by this. And then from the gutter, it runs down. And that first flush of water, a lot of the dust and dirt and sand, you have a filter up there, and that'll take out the big things like the leaves, but dust and dirt and other things that are too small for that filter mesh screen will land in here, and they'll fill up this bottom section. And when this bottom section fills up, then the water will begin flowing into the tank. But that's a pretty small area. So this has to be opened and cleaned out. The bottom of that tube has to be unscrewed and let all the junk flow out of the bottom of that after the first rain every time. And depending upon how much junk is on your solar panels or your roof, if you're using this on a roof, this has to be sized quite precisely, because you don't want to make it too small, or all that junk ends up in your tank anyway by overfilling this. And you don't want it to be too big, because you're wasting a lot of the water you are trying to capture. The tank also has to be appropriately sized, and that's another issue. So this is, we could call it integrated water management because we're integrating water catchment strategies and reuse strategies. Like reuse would be like our gray water system or a septic system potentially. And water catchment is stuff like this. And arguably, rain gardens can be one or both of them. And the nice thing about rain gardens is they use the soil itself as the filtering mechanism. So you have your pump that runs down, at least 30 feet below all that, probably deeper. My house is 200 feet. So we got quite a bit of filtering there. And so I don't have to mess with all this other stuff. So that's the beautiful thing about rain gardens is their simplicity. They don't require as much maintenance. This rainwater catchment, you're out in the rain, emptying these things after the first flush. And then you maybe, depending upon how many leaves blow in, you got to be cleaning these filter systems a lot. And the question of how do you appropriately size these things? Now, there are some models out there that are a little more automatic. This ball will rise as the water fills up and then plug the catchment, the first flush system, this bottom part, and divert the water into the tank. And that's great. Now you can just unscrew the bottom of this and let it dump out. But again, if it's not sized correctly, and this is for a fairly small one, doesn't have a lot of capacity. So you would only be able to take a garden shed or something like that and use this on it, or you'd need multiple ones of these. But then you're out in the rain emptying 5 of them. After the first rain. So anyway, so these first flush systems can solve problems for you if they're designed correctly. They're not super adaptable. They can't always adapt to your neighbor initiating a construction project, 50 feet away from your rainwater catchment tube and then filling it up with a lot of dust. So drinking water. About these things. So this is part of the process in drinking water. Drinking water is problematic from these things. You can't just take rainwater you catch off of your roof and make it drinking water because birds are pooping on your roof, and birds carry salmonella and other things that can live in your water if they get washed in. And so you have to have not just filtration systems, but you have to have UV systems. And this all requires permitting and all kinds of other things. So it's not exactly always cheap or easy if you want to make this a potable water system. But you can save a lot of water if you have something that's appropriately sized. That's another issue, is the tanks are never really big enough. If we go back to this is something like a $500 to $1,000 gallon tank. I think it's 5 feet, it's about 5 feet tall and about 5 feet across. Because you have to be able to reach this, which is, 6 feet or so off the ground. So, if you do the math there, if this solar panel is 20 feet by 40 feet, this will catch maybe the first rainfall event, and then it's going to be full. And then for all the subsequent rainfall, it's not catching anything. Everything's just going someplace else. So they fill up fairly quickly. If you have your whole roof attached to this, California usually gets somewhere around in the neighborhood, depending upon where you are, not California. The North Bay typically gets about 40 inches of rain a year, roughly. And this year we're going to be way over that. Other years we've been way under that. So if you imagine the size of your house, that house has a footprint, that's a rain footprint that's the size of your roof, essentially. If you could capture all the water coming off that roof and put it in a tank, it'd have to be 4 feet deep and the size of your house, which is probably at least 1,000 square feet, if not more. That's a huge amount of water that it's capturing in an average year. And in a big year, it'd be even more. So anything this size isn't even going to come close to catching all of that. So usually, if you really want to have harvested water, you have to have big tanks someplace that you're going to fill up with it, which gets into maintenance along with all these other things that we've been talking about, UV filters and a lot of maintenance. Okay, so gray water systems. So these are only to be used where you have not very polluted water going in. So that it typically means your laundry and your shower are where you can. And even then, you can't use these to irrigate crops that sit on the ground. You can't use them to irrigate your carrots. And that's because there's all kinds of fun things that can live on your skin that, or get in your clothes that you don't want to be eating again. No ground crops. You can irrigate your artichokes and your orchard with it, no problem, because the part of the plant you're eating is not touching the ground. You can't use black water, which is your toilets or your kitchen sink with a disposal and that kind of stuff on it. Yeah, those are considered black water, and that is not something you can add to your water to irrigate with at all. That all goes into a septic system or a sewer system. Again, because our detergents are salts themselves, and our bodies are putting quite a bit of salt in our bath water and our laundry detergent, you are going to run into salt buildup, and that has to get leached out. But these systems are great for conserving irrigation water, especially if you live on city water, because all of your black water is getting piped off-site. So a lot of the water you use is simply leaving your property. This at least allows you to use it. And it's not that these systems aren't that helpful if you don't have good drainage. So even if you are on city water, if you're don't have good drainage, these systems just don't work in the wintertime effectively. But they can still be helpful in the summer. And they don't work that great if you're already on septic, because they're just essentially doing what the septic system was already doing anyway. Yes, they can be helpful, but the utility goes down and down and down as you're as you're off city water, and now you're on septic, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's very briefly about gray water systems and rainwater harvesting. When do we actually need the water? And that's helpful to be thinking about. Well, water use peaks in June. From the single biggest factor in water use is day length. And other factors can trump that, things like wind and heat. So on a hot, windy day in August, you may have more water use than you get on a still cool day in June. But the single biggest factor is still the sunlight. And since August has quite a bit of sunlight, really, on average, we see greater water use in June than any other time of year. The funny thing is that we're still usually have water in our soils from the rains that we got in March, April, and May. Now, some years, drought years, when the rains stop in March, yeah, you may actually be, you may be seeing us use up the groundwater in June, but most years we're really using up the groundwater starting in July. So that's what this is about, is plants are using water like crazy in June, and that's what exhausts the groundwater supplies in part, along with us pumping, and it gets hot, so we're pumping water as well. So by July and August, that's where the water deficits really come in. So that's when we need to irrigate. Where do we need to irrigate? Well, we're hydrozoning. So water hydrozoning, if you don't know, means that we're grouping plants with similar water needs together, right? So in this diagram, we have a lawn with cool season grass. We can tell because it's at about 70% of ETO. If you don't know what ETO means, that's reference evapotranspiration. And we don't have a lot of time to go into that, but you can find reference evapotranspiration. It is determined by comparing to a reference plant, and that's cool season grass, which is a big water user. So most references, when we talk about ETO, it's usually the number is about, our reference number is 1. That's how much cool season grass uses. And everything else uses some percentage of that. So for instance, we know we're using cool season grass, or at least think high water use plants, because they're using 0.7 or 70% of the ETO. And you can go to, if you want to know more about ETO and how it's calculated and what ETO zone you're in, you can go to this website and figure it out. In terms of the plants that you're using and how they fit into this, WUCALS is another thing. That's water use classification of landscape species. And CIMMYS stands for California Irrigation Management Information System. So if you're wondering what CIMMYS is, that's what it stands for. WUCALS is a reference book that estimates people's best guesses as to what plant water needs are in a given area of the state, because of the heat that it sees in the summer and the rainfall it gets and a number of other things. So the plants will be listed as being in, say, irrigation zone 2 Wu calls a list in zone 2, which is in Northern California, as being low, medium, or high. And in other zones, like in the Central Valley, it might be medium or high water use, not low. Those kinds of ideas. So Wu calls is a reference, and we figure out where to plant based on grouping plants with similar water needs. Low water need plants should be grouped with low water need plants, and high water need plants could be grouped with other high water need plants, so that you can irrigate them all about the same and you're using your water most efficiently. It doesn't mean you can't have high water use plants. It means that where you should probably limit your use of high water use plants, and where you have them, you want to water them about the same so they all get what they need. By the way, most of your vegetables and fruit crops are all high water use because it takes a lot of water to grow an apple and make it sweet. We can get back to that in a minute too. Turns out water is also a key factor in determining plant flammability. And this is part of the maintenance thing. When you have a garden, you need to maintain it, and that includes regular watering. So when you're looking at plant flammability, a lot of people tend to think, oh, well, I pick a species and that's going to give me what I need for the flammability coefficient. No, that's really not true. Ice plant burns if you dry it out enough. And ice plant is pretty inflammable if it's well watered. So it's not really about the species, and I'll come back to that a little bit later too. It's really about how you maintain it. So adequate watering of your landscape is one of those really key factors in determining how fire resistant your landscape is. Design is also a key factor. Zone 0, which is the area right around the 5-foot perimeter around the house, which in this planting plan doesn't really look like they've got an adequate zone 0. So this was clearly something that was designed back before people were really thinking about this a lot. So let's talk about zone 0 and what it means. We have this idea often that defensible space is going to save our house because it'll be hard for the landscape to burn up to our house and set our house on fire. But if you really look at the numbers, 80% of home ignitions are caused by embers, which are lofted on the wind. So the fire isn't burning up to our house and setting it on fire. It's coming into the house and landing on the house in the form of these little embers that get into the leaves in our gutters, that get into leaves that are piled up near the base of our house in that 5-foot defensible space zone, the place that has to be kept lean, clean, and green. And you can see this over and over and over again. This is a picture of the Paradise Fire. And you can see the trees did not burn coming up to these houses. The houses burned and set the trees on fire. How do you know? Because the trees in between all the houses are fried, and the trees all around the houses are fine for the most part. So this is what we saw in Paradise. Now, if you think I'm cherry picking my data and saying, oh, I'll just take this one slide from Paradise and okay, so let's take a look at that. This is San Diego from 20 years ago. We all know that eucalyptus trees are horribly flammable. That's what everybody tells us. Oh, blue gums, that's a problem. These are blue gum ukes. How many of those blue gum ukes? Clearly, the blue gum ukes set the houses on fire, right? Not. The houses were not even capable of setting the blue gums on fire. That's how flammable blue gums are. Yes, granted, if you have a very drought-stressed blue gum and you've got right next to a house, then it might get set on fire. Although that didn't happen even up Reedley Road in Sonoma County. The blue gums ended up surviving the fire. The houses burned. It wasn't the houses set the blue gums on fire, just like in this photo. Again, if you think I'm cherry picking, here's Coffee Park, right in our own backyard. Before and after pictures, same rough neighborhood. Most of the trees still have leaves on them. They didn't catch fire, yet the entire neighborhood burned. It's not the landscape setting the houses on fire. I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm saying that's not how it happens 80% of the time or better. It's the houses setting the trees on fire, and over again. So you can see, again, here in these borderline zones, the trees are still green, the houses are gone. Now, I am not saying plants can't be a problem, but it's about community. It's about the plant community, just like it's about our housing community. When the houses are next to each other, your biggest threat isn't the plants, it's your neighbor's house. When the plants grow in a dense community like this is Bishop Pine out in Point Reyes, If one of these gets lit, everything else is going. The fuels go stretch from right next to the ground all the way to the tops of the canopies, and these plants are cheek by jowl, right? So that's bishop pine. If you think this is about the species, though, sorry, wrong way. This is also bishop pine on the coast, and it has plenty of space around it. And you probably couldn't light that tree with a blowtorch if you tried. It's a conifer, but it's got plenty of space from the ground. The ground is very lean on fuels. It's a golf course. And it's got adequate spacing from the rest of the trees. So So it's not really about species. It's mostly about how a plant is maintained and what your landscape design looks like. So back to community. This is a picture of the Oakland fire. Here's a house that breaks all the rules of defensible space. And it's one of the only houses that survives the Oakland fire. Why? And it's because the biggest threat from a wildfire to houses is embers. And as soon as one house catches, the biggest threat to that house, as soon as one house catches, it's the biggest threat to the neighbor's house because it's going to burn hot. And that's what happened in Oakland. And the reason this house survived is it didn't catch fire from embers. It's got a tile roof and stucco siding. Even though it broke all the rules of defensible space, it's got plants right up next to it. It didn't burn because the plants didn't burn because the house didn't set them on fire. But this relieves a question. If you do live in an environment that has a lot of houses all grown next to each other, all built next to each other, how do you survive the fire? And that's about neighborhood planning. And it's starting to get outside of what we typically talk about when we're talking about how do we landscape for global warming. Neighborhood planning involves neighborhood meetings, involves getting to know your neighbors. It involves city planning. It involves escape routes. It involves being prepared. It involves building standards and permits and all kinds of other things. I don't have time to talk about them today. We could spend an hour talking about each one of those things. But it does involve community action. You are going to make it or not as a community because it's your houses that are the threat to the other houses around them. So, good fences make good neighbors? Not really, especially if those fences are hedges. Now it's just because their hedges are really not fire safe by design. Why not? Because we shear them and that leaves lots of fine, twiggy, broken growth. So fire is going to run right down a hedge. And oddly enough, here we have it. This is the state capitol. We got hedges running right to it. It is the poster child for fire in California. So we're going to hope, it's probably pretty well watered because it's in Sacramento. So with any luck, those plants are moist enough that they won't burn so easily. But, and maybe they have enough defensible space, 0 to 5 feet from the house, that kind of thing. Next. Okay, so the bottom line is, we can grow just about anything in California. Maybe not everywhere in California, but you've got an environment in California where at least you can probably grow your spruce that grows at tree line, and we got another place that'll grow your aloe that grows in the desert. But should we, is the question. We should not be planting a lot of things that have high water use. Now, even that isn't always true. If you live in an area that's got a high water table and you live in what's essentially swamplands, I live in the Laguna de Santa Rosa, I can get away with from fairly high water use plants. In fact, they're pretty well adapted to it. That's what survives winter flooding. But so we need to be cognizant of the water use that our plants do and suit them to the site, right? Likewise, fire. This insurance company, fire departments, and fire safe councils are all telling us about, just because you can plant it doesn't mean you should, right? And invasiveness. So we've got links to Calypsy and things along those lines. And ranchers and parklands and water districts will all hate you for planting broom in your yard or any number of other species. If you've got questions about whether to go, what you can do, look at Calypsy. I've got a whole slide on it later. And the other shame about all this is we live in the California floristic province, which is one of the richest floristic provinces in the world. We have more native species in California than you have that are endemic to California than you have in the entire rest of the United States. We have a huge number of plants that only grow here. Many of them won't grow anywhere else. And so, part of me, it's like a shame to kind of watch us. I'm not, I'll get off my soapbox in a minute. But trying to make California into Australia by packing it full of grevilleas and ukes, not that I have anything against Australia, but California's a pretty incredible place on its own. Why aren't we celebrating that? The Australian things can be a problem, right? Because why do we want to plant natives? Because they're already part of our established ecosystems here. They include a bunch of mycorrhizal fungi. We don't even know what we're losing because we don't even know half the mycorrhizal fungi out there. Our best estimates at the most, we know 80% of the fungi that live underground. So we can't even tell you what's going extinct. And those plants that are part of these systems can build better networks, and they're adapted to our local conditions. And so, you know, if you want to figure out what to plant, check your local microclimate and soils, and then go to the California Native Plant Society's webpage, which is called CalScape. And I've got references to that at the end too. And you can go look up any plant you want to look. You can look up by where you live, what grows here naturally. These plants often stay hydrated with average rainfall, and hydrated plants are more fire resistant than drought-stressed plants. And then local fauna depend on these species. So other summer dry plants, yeah, okay, you can plant Australian, you can plant South African plants, and they're cool. I get it. And there's nothing wrong with planting a few of these things, especially if you don't live at the wildland-urban interface where they might be able to escape. But we've brought in plenty of things that are doing a lot of damage to California ecosystems already. Exotic Mediterranean plants like blue gum eucalyptus, gorse, and French broom that are doing a lot. And they're all Mediterranean natives. They grow great here, and that's part of the problem. If you are curious about what to plant or what not to plant, go to the California Invasive Plant Council. So, you know, okay, so we say natives, but California has this huge floristic province that includes everything from alpine environments to swamp environments to desert environments. We have a myriad of local microclimates. So how do you pick which natives? Well, global warming is likely to shift these, and we know they're going to be changing, and nobody's exactly sure how this is going to turn out. Is it just warming, or will weather patterns shift? So 25,000 years ago, California had a monsoon rain climate in parts of the state, which meant we got summer rain. And that'll be a disaster for California ag, particularly for wine grapes, if that happens here. And we don't really know what's going to happen here. But it'll be great news for Engelmann oaks and some of the other relictual species that are still hanging on by their fingernails from the Pleistocene, and other things that used to grow native in California, like liquid ambers and tupelo and a number of other trees that are now only found in the eastern US that'll love it if we have. You ever wonder why liquid ambers grow so well in California? Because they used to grow here 25,000 years ago, and as long as they get enough summer water, they'll do okay. So what is the Southern proxy model, and what are we talking about? Well, this is what the climate zones look out of the US Sunset Guide. And basically all we're saying is we're thinking about having landscapes. We're thinking about the future as if the landscapes just got shifted south by some number amount. Now that number, we're picking points on a curve. And probably right now, our climate's a lot like what Santa Cruz used to be 30 years ago, right? And 30 years from now, our climate here is going to start looking probably more like it does in Santa Maria, Atascadero, those kinds of areas. And 30 years after that, it's going to probably be down around Santa Barbara. We don't really know how far this is going to go or exactly how it's going to work, but we can make some educated guesses, right? So this is what it looks like today. Notice a lot of Marin is covered in and Sonoma is covered in zones 15, 16, 17, a little bit of zone 14. And then if you look at Lake Berryessa, that's where zone 7 is, right? If we look in Southern Cal, about 200 miles south of here in the Santa Maria Road region, wow, look how much closer zone 7 is to the coast. And look how small zones 15, 16. But if you're right on the coast, it's still zone 17. So that's how we're sort of saying it's time to think about these things. And how are we going to negotiate this? And you'll probably be somewhere in here. I'm imagining, you know, my place is probably going to be somewhere around probably zone 14 or 15. And it's currently not that different from zone. It is 14 or 15. So maybe I'll get lucky. Maybe it'll be zone 7. We'll see. So this gets to be a problem though for rare species, like we were just talking about. Kitati and Sebastopol and some other places are little havens for rare species, and they don't have other ranges to move north into. So if they're going to survive, they're probably going to need us to move them. And similarly, if we're going to start thinking about what'll be surviving up here in Marin and Sonoma, that's probably not those rare species we have right now. It might be something that you find growing around Atascadero or San Luis Obispo. Or, even farther south, Santa Barbara. It just depends upon how far you want to go and how many years you're projecting into the future. So we could find some of those rare species that grow down there and plant them up here, and they'd probably do pretty well in the near future anyway. So are these climate models right? Again, nobody's certain, and things could get silly. Especially if we have increased volcanism with the polar ice caps having a lot less weight on them. If we get volcanoes exploding and sending a bunch of ash into the air, it could cool things down. It's like nobody really knows what's going to happen. But why do we care about having just these plants move? Well, a lot of the native bees, I know I've got a picture of a European honeybee right here, but a lot of the animals that depend on these plants are going to need these refugia to be able to go to. They're going to need these plants to be there when they start having to move north because it's too hot or too dry for them. So that's helpful. And, it's not just the European honeybee. I know that's the poster child for a lot of pollinators, but quite honestly, a lot of our native bees are way cooler. Yeah, you don't get honey from them, but this is one of our sweat bees. And some of these species are more efficient pollinators than the European honeybee as well. So a lot of native plants depend on these, and they depend on the flowers in turn. So we want to have them moving around. And some of these, syrphid flies, which produce these little caterpillars that look kind of like this. Syrphid flies look like bees, some of them more so than this one, but they're not. They're flies, and their larvae are really good at helping us keep pest populations under control. In this case, they're little things that look like caterpillars, but they're not. People squish them often thinking that they're caterpillars eating their plants. They're really eating the aphids. And these help keep the pests at bay. And even more so with fancy things like parasitic wasps like this, which is, you see parasitizing a caterpillar here. And these guys all remember how we were talking about communities, plant communities, and we were talking about communities in the sense of our human communities, our neighborhoods. Well, we're also talking about communities in terms of parasitoids. They want to live in a good neighborhood too. And a good neighborhood means that it's got food. It's got food that looks like this. This is what they're feeding on, nectar and pollen. It's got food for the kids. It's got pests, and it's got shelter. So a lot of these tiny little wasps that are this small go into places like this, where deep inside that grass on a windy day, that's where they're hanging out and trying to get by. So if you're curious about the plants that you can plant that will help natives get by, there's a whole book on this from the Xerces Society, Farming with Native Beneficial Insects. And I have a whole references page at the end that has all these links. So don't worry about furiously copying this stuff down. It'll be made available to Carrie. She'll have a chance to be able to use these to be able to, she'll get a chance to have this so you can go look at them later if you want them. So again, food. Stuff like ceanothus, something that blooms in the wintertime, one of the only pollen sources that's out there in cold weather. The bees depend on it. Other things not to plant, just sort of FYI. When you bring stuff home from a nursery, nurseries are struggling. They're having a hard time controlling things like Phytophthora. That's because these are essentially invisible plant pathogens. The only time you get to know that you've got them is when your plants start dying and you pull them up and you realize their root systems have all rotted. And they're rampant in the nursery trade because they'll be spreading for weeks before you start seeing your first plants die off. And that means you've been selling these things for weeks to the unwitting customers before you even realized you had a problem. So I'm not saying that people aren't trying to be diligent in their maintenance and looking for this stuff. It's just really hard to find. So that's one of the reasons it's hard to control. So generally speaking, when we bring plants home from a nursery, I keep them in a fairly shady place on my property for several weeks, and anything that begins dying before I'm ready to plant it out, I chuck it. That's how I can make sure it's not making it out. And I don't water to the point of letting water flow out of the bottom of the thing, because that's how Phytophthora spread. They spread in water. And one way to not do this is to consider planting from seed, which is what I'm doing with most of my oaks now. I'm burying acorns. So what about vegetables? We were talking about rain gardens and flooding. Flooding's bad for your vegetable gardens. If you've got flooding problems on your property, you probably need to grow your vegetable gardens in raised beds, because flooding, especially if you're in an area with septic systems, means that your vegetables are potentially being exposed to sewage from, even if your septic system's in great shape. If you've got a neighbor here nearby where the water could be flowing from their property to yours in heavy rain events, you got a problem. So vegetable gardens should be in up off the ground or someplace where they're not going to get exposed to flood waters. And they're not drought tolerant. They're going to take a lot of water, and that's okay, because most of our fruits and vegetables are grown here in California. That means if they're not growing in your backyard, they're growing on somebody's farm, and they're using water, California water someplace, and that water is being pumped to their farm just as much as it's being pumped to your house. And furthermore, that vegetable is now being loaded onto a truck and driven over here. The energy cost of those vegetables that are not grown on your site are pretty high, both from a water and transport point of view. So edibles gardening is sustainable as long as it's done right. So, see all the previous slides and the things we've been talking about. And as long as you eat it. I've got one of my neighbors grows vegetables, and they're never home to harvest it, and everything goes to waste. I don't know why they bother. Okay. Right plant, right place. So this is the basic tenet to all the good landscaping, right? The right landscape plant shouldn't need much. The exception is, of course, edibles. Veggies in this climate will want summer water. That's the only way you're going to get decent veggies or decent fruits. So let's talk briefly about shade and energy conservation. 40% of the unwanted heat in your house comes in through windows. So if you have summer shade, or at least shade at the right time of year, it can make a big difference. And you can use deciduous trees. Wait. Sorry about this. This is incorrect. I apologize. To the west, not to the south. And I'll explain exactly why in a minute. I apologize. I didn't catch this. This slide was borrowed from somebody else. We're going to discuss that just now. This is usually a discussion. So trees and carbon, and how can you use landscape plants to sequester carbon, and what's the most effective way to do that? So this is usually a discussion of carbon sequestration, and it usually starts off with people getting the idea they might be able to qualify for carbon credits for having some big trees on their property. And the answer is you won't. And why not? It's because you need to be able to document your plants and the amount and their current growth state. And you're going to need to be able to submit that with regular inspections to document the amount of growth that your trees have been put on. And that means you're going to have a registered professional forester out there visiting your property, and you will make something like 0.4 cents a pound for carbon, something like that. And it will never pay for a registered professional forester's time at that kind of a rate unless you own thousands of acres of forest land that have access to water and a forest on them already. Because what you have to do is you have to document a baseline that says, this is the existing trees that I have, and now I'm going to show you over time that I am sequestering carbon, and that's in the form of tree growth. So minimum break-even point on the costs is thousands of acres on this. So we're really not talking about carbon credits here. What we're talking about is the do right thing that feels good. And how can you plant something that, even if you can't get paid for it effectively, how do you help the environment, especially your urban environment, by sequestering carbon? And I'm going to make the argument is you can't, but we will talk about what the carbon costs are and how trees. So we're going to talk about urban tree planting. And this often focuses on species people ask about me, what tree can I plant to sequester the most carbon? And that's not the question we're going to try and answer today. We're going to talk about correctly placed trees and have a large carbon impact by reducing energy, our fossil fuel consumption in the home. And that's going to be done with summer shade and winter sun and windbreaks. So let's talk a little bit about why this is. So what trees typically sequester is about 2 kilograms of carbon of per square yard of canopy per year. And at the current rates, which is TerraPass, I got that from TerraPass, is about 0.0, it's 4 cents per pound. Sorry. So I said it was 0.4 cents per pound. It's not, it's 4 cents per pound. And so ideally, you'd think, well, we want the biggest, fastest trees that we can possibly put in there to sequester the most carbon. And that's true. But if you look at the equation for photosynthesis, which is right here on at the bottom of that first bullet point, you have 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O through the process of photosynthesis gives you 1 sugar plus 6 O2. You'll notice that the amount of CO2 you can sequester is directly tied to the amount of water you can provide. In California, we don't have unlimited amounts of water. You can ask that kind of a question in Louisiana just fine, but here, not so much. What you need to be able to ask is what trees will survive in California's dry summers that can still be around to sequester carbon next year. And the trees that can be here for hundreds of years under varying conditions and put on a large amount of carbon, ultimately, that's what you want. So that means we're not talking about growing redwoods in the Central Valley because we could never supply them with enough water or fog, most specifically, to be able to grow effectively. What we're talking about is growing valley oaks in the middle of California. We're talking about redwoods on the North Coast. We're talking about coast live oaks throughout most of the rest of coastal California, until we get into Southern California, and then we might be talking about completely different trees entirely. So water's limited here, and urban homeowners are buying smaller trees anyway because of lower maintenance costs and lower water usage, and they have to pay a bill for this. A lot of fire safe councils are encouraging smaller trees too, but small trees only provide small benefits, so I'm going to make a case why we might want to still think about big trees. Partly it's carbon. Unfortunately, as these things say, California's experienced drought for millennia on, and here we are. These are the years in 1576, 1579. We both experienced droughts then, and that was 450 years ago before we had any of our modern systems in place that, we could arguably use to help this stuff. We're not. Our modern systems are making a mess out of things. But drought's a reality of living in California. But we have to get by in long periods without rain, and we have heat in a lot of California. And shade was an integral part of the design of Southern California cities until the advent of cheap electricity in the 1930s. So you look at any of the old towns in California, in Central Valley in particular, but you can find it in parts of Southern California that hadn't already been paved. You can find big trees, and that's how they kept themselves cool. And cooling makes a huge difference. Shade makes a huge difference in cooling of urban areas, even in little towns. It doesn't have to be super urbanized for this. But heating, when you're trying to heat in the winter, shade is detrimental. So what do we do about that? Well, we don't want winter shade. But deciduous trees still provide, if you look at those roof, it's being shaded about 20% of the roof is being shaded by just the bare tree limbs on this winter roof. So even a deciduous tree still provides about 20% shading, and an evergreen tree would provide more like 100%. So in the winter, we don't want shade, and it hits us the reason is because we get reduced sunlight and reduced heat, but it's a fairly minor effect. Why? Because the days are already so short and the sun is low and weak. Okay, but in the summer, we do want shade. The problem here is the sun's almost directly overhead. It's a major effect. You get the difference between having a tree even next to your house within 10 feet of the edge of your house can be 10 degrees or more. Even if a tree doesn't directly shade your house, it just shades the lawn next to your house. And it can be upwards of 10 degrees if the sun is high and intense and you have a shadow directly on your roof. So for summer shade, you may want that tree directly over your roof. But so this is why I'm going to argue against having shade trees on the south side of your house, because they have to be on top of your house to be able to provide shade on the south side. And I'll show you why. But afternoon shadows are long. So a tree that's on the west side of your house will provide shade in the afternoon, even if it's not right over your house. And that's when it typically gets the hottest anyway. So that's where you want your tree. Okay, so here's really quickly. On the days of the vernal and autumnal equinox, we are at 38° north latitude and the sun's rays are directly overhead on the equator, right? Really quickly. At the summer solstice, the sun is almost directly overhead. Here in the North Bay, it's about 14 degrees to 15 degrees off of vertical, right? But that's pretty much directly overhead. So that means you're only going to get a 14-degree shadow out of that tree, right? In the winter, on the other hand, you're going to get a 60-degree shadow because it's 60 degrees. So the sun's only about 30 degrees over the horizon. So the shadows are huge in the winter, right? So that means even if you had a tree that was directly over your house in the winter, the sun's coming in underneath the canopy of that tree. So you're getting sun in the winter. And so if the tree's on the south side of your house, it should be on top of your house practically. You need the trunk of that tree within about 5 feet of your house to be able to make the best use of both summer shade and winter sun. So here's an illustrated example, right? If we have trees fairly close to the house, they're overhanging the roof of our house. The 14.5 degrees at summer solstice is about where we're going to see our shadow. But in the winter, we're going to see the sun being blocked by those same trees. So having an evergreen tree on the south side of your house is a terrible idea because you're going to see huge heating bills, and you might see some reduction in summer cooling bills, depending upon how it goes. So tree location and sun. If you've got a tree that's on the north side of your house, it has no appreciable effect. In the summer, it's going to be providing shade to the north side of it. So if it's on the north side of your house, you're on the south side of the tree, you're going to have no effect, right? And in the winter, it's going to be the same. It's going to have no effect, or even in September. The only, in the winter, unfortunately, there is a slight negative effect for deciduous, for trees, because they channel wind over your house. Which is an unfortunate thing, but trees do tend to, so that means your house experiences wind chill. You're heating the inside of the house, and there's more the wind whips over your house. So if the trees are sitting on the north side of your house, they're providing you zero benefit, but they are channeling the wind over your house, not through the trees. So you actually see they're costing you money, trees on the north side of your house, especially if they're planted in a line that does this. So the only way that you're getting a benefit from these trees in the summer is if they're really close to the house, and your fire department may have something to say about that. Even if you've cleared the branches away from your roof, they're over your roof, and now you're going to have to get up there and clear your gutters more than one time a year. So it's a maintenance hassle. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. You get great benefits, but only if you clear your gutters. So here's the same idea, right? Trees planted on the north in a row. That's probably not a good idea. That's going to channel things. Trees planted on the south, also not really a good idea. But trees planted to the west, especially if they're evergreen, most houses experience a wind effect. We'll get to that. So most houses in California, your prevailing winds are from the west, at least if we're near the coast like we are in the north, in the Bay Area. And your house may be different, and this is why you got to take your microclimates into account. West-facing evergreens will provide you shade in the summer, and they'll provide some wind blocking in the winter. And the wind blocking extends about 2 to 3 times the height of the tree. So if you got a 60-foot tree, you can have a wind blocking effect up to 120 feet away well, all the way to potentially 180, but it's a curve and it starts tapering off. So we want trees planted on the west side, not the south side, for evergreen trees. On the east side, you may want deciduous trees. They'll allow you to get some shade in the summer, and in the winter, when you want that heat, they'll allow some winter sun through. Okay, so carbon costs, right? Interior of a house temp is reduced between 8 and 20 degrees Fahrenheit by having shade on your house. And an 8-degree reduction in 8-degree Fahrenheit reduction is a 10% energy savings for your air conditioning. These are all from Greg McPherson. I have the references at the end of this. You see a bigger savings in milder climates like we have in Marin because you may not turn on your AC at all. Whereas in the middle of summer in the Central Valley, you'll be turning your AC on even if you have shade on because it's still hot. So you get the biggest savings here on the coast. So you reduce your electricity usage. That means you reduce your carbon emissions, and the amount of electricity you reduce, or heating oil or gas or whatever, is way bigger than any amount of carbon you can sequester. So this is why we care about carbon and what we care about when you're putting it in. It has to do with putting the right tree in the right place on your property to reduce your carbon footprint. Big trees sequester a lot of carbon, so we would like to use big trees because they'll give you better benefits, but they also use a lot of water. So water use is equal to carbon emissions. We sort of covered that. So the next question is, what tree do you put in that'll provide summer shade and wind screening without using irrigation water? Again, California native species. If you've got questions about where it comes from, stuff that's endemic to your neighborhood. Look what grows on the hillsides around you. And that's what you probably want to plant near your house. It's what's going to survive without a whole lot of extra anything. So I just want to point out, plans are always site specific. I'm talking in very broad generalities here. You may want to take a very careful look at your plants. I would suggest planting evergreens 50 feet from your house as a general rule. On the west side is probably a pretty good year. No trees on the north side, or plant them more than 30 feet from your house. So it's often stated that having limbs over your roof is a fire hazard. That's not actually supported by the research. A 2019 study by Alexandra Serfard is sometimes just cited as the justification for don't having your branches over roofs. But what it really says, and you can get it from Alexandra Serfard herself, in a conversation she had with Ellie Inslee in 2020, she basically said that's a correlation, not a causation. The houses are setting the tree limbs on fire as much as the trees present any risk to the houses. So therefore, what she's doing a correlatory study, and what it shows is that houses are lost where tree limbs overhang them as much as tree limbs are lost where houses are built underneath them. So we can't go into tree assessment too much beyond a point. You need to assess them for structure, health, and water use. You don't want tree limbs over your house if the plant's not sturdy. So then you need a professional assessment. Trees provide great habitat value. A reminder herein is that in the end, all of this stuff is connected. Your small garden counts. Your one patch in a quilt that is the landscape, for better or worse. And unfortunately, some of the neighbors' decisions on landscaping, informed or not, are going to affect you. So it's going to take thoughtful planting, putting the right plant in the right place. And this means hydrozoning, putting in rain gardens, summer shade, winter sun, future climate, fire safety, pollinators, ecosystem harmony. There's a lot to balance. So at the risk of being trite, don't let the be perfect be the enemy of the good. Think globally, act locally, all that other stuff that you see on bumper stickers. Yeah, but it may be trite, but it's nonetheless true in what we're doing. So I don't know if I still have time for questions. I will take them, and I hope that Carrie or Bate have had it. Oh, acknowledgements. I have some pictures I stole. Kathy Keatley Garvey has been great on all those. She's a master gardener out of the Yolo County, and she's a fantastic photographer. I borrowed a bunch of her photos for this. So thank you, Kathy. And thank you for the 2 places I borrowed some of the other images from. And these are my references. I'll leave that up for people who want to go from here. And yeah, questions. Do we have time?
And thank you so much. You know, everyone who's still here probably wants to know about questions and answers, right? So we only lost about 10 people. Thanks for everyone who's staying. I do have a few questions that I wrote down from the chat, but really briefly, I want to say a few things about upcoming events and how to stay in touch, like
Sounds
2
good.
minutes max. So amazing information that we can actually use. So thankful, Stephen. Everyone, if we could give him a round of applause, that was really wonderful. Please do email me or him with any questions or follow-ups we don't get to right now. So, quick reminder, this is only one of 20 events that CEI with Sonoma State University is holding this semester. We have already done our 2 virtual events, but we will have another round of them both at our Osborne Preserve, which is only 15 minutes up the mountain from Sonoma State, and at our Galbraith Preserve, which is in Anderson Valley of Mendocino County. So you can see all of those events at cei.sonoma.edu/calendar. The next one coming up is called Laguna Watershed Perspectives. It's on Sunday, April 2nd at 10 a.m. and it's led by our own education manager and a Sonoma State University geology student who's also a naturalist. And it's also co-hosted by the Laguna de Santa Rosa Foundation. It should be a really fascinating one about geology and upstream and downstream along the watershed and how they're all connected. And then this is the last event I'm going to highlight before I turn it back over to questions. This event might be particularly interesting for master gardeners because you might not know, in addition to being the environmental horticulture advisor, Stephen Swain is also a co-advisor to the sudden oak death outreach program in Sonoma County. And we are holding our annual sudden oak death blitzes. So sudden oak death is a tree disease, it's invasive, and there's a whole program that's been going on with UC Berkeley for almost 20 years now, and a team of master gardeners in Sonoma County called the sod specialists run an outreach program and help create blitz events throughout Sonoma and Mendocino counties. We've transitioned from COVID, and so now lots of it's online. You can train online, you can receive packets by mail. It's a pretty easy system, even if you're not super local. And so I really invite you to look into these, and particularly to look into the 2 docent-led events. One's at Osborne Preserve, one is at Galbraith Preserve. And the Osborne event is also fully bilingual in Spanish with materials, training, and everything you would need to make it a fully bilingual in Spanish event. So that one's on May 13th. And the Galbraith event is on May 15th. And then that full weekend is going to be when everybody else can get packets in the mail. And just 2 quick things. A lot of people decide to be a part of these either because they have trees on their property or their neighborhoods or nearby that they want to get tested. And this is one of the only ways to do that for free. Otherwise, it costs quite a bit of money to do. And I should say it's bay laurel trees or tan oak trees, because those are what carry the disease. And the other reason to do this is to get into nature and help science. It's great for community service hours for middle school and high school students. I actually help high schoolers do this at several places. And just to contribute. There's no way that science could do this without the help of community volunteers. And if any master gardeners are excited about the program in general and just want to ask me about how to get involved more, feel free to ask me or Stephen. So I'll go ahead and put those all in the chat. But first off, Stephen, here are a few questions. Maybe you can answer these. So the first one is, what do you do if you have inherited a 1/4 acre full of invasive species weeds? I keep cutting them back, but have trouble getting native plants to take, even after 2 to 3 years. And amazingly, we had 2 people from the audience chime in. So one person suggests that it takes time and effort, and it depends on the species. Several years of cutting, years of pulling starts, but then a lot of existing natives that were struggling took off once you remove some of this invasive material like broom. And then another person remarked to test your soil pH. Broom tends to alter the soil pH, making it hard for other plants to grow there. But Stephen, did you have any other advice?
So my advice would be, is it broom that we're talking about in particular, or is it just weeds in general? Because I heard weeds.
The first person didn't specify.
No. Can I answer?
Yeah,
It's not broom.
it's
What I
not broom.
no, it's other types of sort of regular garden weeds.
Things
I
along the lines of oxalis and dandelion and things along those lines.
yes, exactly.
Got it. Yeah. So part of it, I think, it depends upon how severe we want to be about this. I have made peace with. I try to get rid of the really nasty things that are exotic. You know, the field bindweed and skeleton weed and that show up on. You know, all I can do is speak from my own. It's a lot about values and how much effort and time you're willing to put in, and whether or not you're going to embrace more extreme measures. Some and you need to know your weeds. So there are some weeds out there. Japanese knotweed is one of them that you really can't manage. They've got root systems that go down 10 feet and you can't manage it without herbicides. And I don't mean to say that's where we need to go. It's certainly not where we need to go with most weeds. I make peace with an awful lot of them. I look for the worst ones and decide that I'm going to get rid of those. But if your goal is to take something that's very heavily weed infested and turn it into a native plant preserve, you've got a lot of work cut out for you. And you may find out that herbicides are your friend from a cost effectiveness point of view, because not everybody can just dig everything up. Other than that, there are options. You can go through and you can put in, say, sheet mulching, which works great. But you know, you said it's 2/3 of an acre or something.
It's a
Quarter
little
of an acre.
than a quarter of an acre. Yeah.
That's still a lot of work, sheet mulching, and it's going to kill off. It will kill off an awful lot of the plants that exist on the site already. So it's sort of a judgment call. How badly do you want to get rid of it? I think for the weeds that aren't so bad, we are actually pulling burr clover as well, but I'm letting a whole bunch of the exotic clovers stay because I can do that and still let, say, the purple needlegrass come back and a bunch of other things that will work with it. And I think that's the best I'm going to be able to do. So that was the choice. That was a decision I made. I do, if you're asking and you care, use Roundup for some of the really, really bad things. I've got white poplar that has been established there for about 40 years, and it's constantly trying to turn my entire backyard because it sprouts from its own roots and just makes it a white poplar forest. And I'm digging them up. But when I kill one of the major white poplars, I just paint a little bit of Roundup right on the top of that stump. And it saves me huge amounts of work and it makes it possible. Otherwise, I would simply be cutting trees every year and be on this treadmill of cutting trees and trying to cut back and the trees coming back even harder. And there's only so much a person can do. So I'm not a fan of glyphosate, don't get me wrong, but I use it very judiciously when I feel like I have to meet my restoration goals without breaking the bank, because I don't have unlimited amounts of money at these things either. So I don't know if that helps. Is there something else I can help? Did I answer your question?
You did completely. Unfortunately, you had the answer that most people have given me. I've been trying to stay away from glyphosate, but thank you very much. I appreciate the advice.
All right, we did have another question. This is from way back in the beginning. It is, can you use rainwater for filling up a swimming pool?
Yeah, I believe you can. You probably still have to meet, I don't think it's regulated. I think you run into health problems if you don't do something to keep the growth of potential pathogens down in the swimming pool. So you're still going to want to use, you're still going to have to treat it somehow. That may mean chlorine. It may mean salts. But yeah, I believe you can use rainwater just fine to fill up a swimming pool. It's a heck of a lot cheaper. And that's one of the few places that would actually be able to take all the rainwater that you collect on your roof and you could just funnel it into your pool, and it'd probably do a good job of it. In a year like this, you'd probably fill the swimming pool for free. But you'd still need to treat it somehow.
We had a few people make comments. Thank you for those, but I'm not going to read those out loud. And the last one was just, how will references be made available? So I personally plan to email everyone who registered today, whether you could attend live or not. And I can include everything that Stephen has shown us in that email, but you can also always email me, and I put my email in the chat, unless you have anything to add, Stephen, to that question.
No. This is most of this stuff. I think it's probably more than most people will want to know. The Alexandra Safard, if you want to read her paper, as factors associated with structures loss, that's the about tree limbs over your house, right? And when you read that, it's a little less than clear, but it is a correlation than causational. And like the bottom one, Zhang, it's just talking about that. I'm showing where the science has come from on the whole wind and the amount of heating benefit that comes from wind blocks.
Someone does want to know if you're making slides available or if it will just be the recording.
I can provide you guys with slides in a format. That's not a problem. I would prefer that nobody borrow, or I can do it in a
We'll make it a PDF.
A PDF. Yeah, that won't have every image that we've used, but it'll have stuff like this, and it'll have all the written content for sure.
Ooh, we just got another question that I really like.
Okay.
Any advice for getting started in a career of landscaping with native plants?
Well, landscaping with native plants. Yeah. I mean, it depends upon exactly where you want to go with the landscaping with native plants. There's 1,000 ways to get training. One of them, if it's just landscaping strictly, and you don't want to do tree work, or you don't want to do landscape, you're not looking to do landscape architecture or something like that. There are actual architecture requires a degree, right? Tree work generally requires professional level training, and that you can get that through the ISA. Honestly, you don't need anything to start with native plants. I would suggest, if you really want to be a native plant landscaper, you join the California Native Plant Society and maybe start working part-time at a native plant nursery. That would get you a long way toward that. To help boost your knowledge, if you feel like you're not up to snuff on those. And then go get qualified water efficient landscape training. That's going to cost money, but it's a great way to get into a lot of these things that we were just talking about. I offer a bilingual landscaping class usually in February of every year. If you're into bilingual landscaping, it's very, very basic. You can join the Marin or the Sonoma County Master Gardeners and get a much more in-depth class, but it's a volunteer organization. And it's first and foremost that you would be able to build up a great knowledge of landscaping from that alone. There are landscaping classes at Santa Rosa Junior College. So there's 1,000 ways to do that. And I don't know, I can't be more specific without, you're welcome to come and talk to me, my office, or give me a call. I'd be happy to talk to you more specifically if we can narrow down what you're interested in beyond native plants. And yeah.
And I also did put the link in the chat just now for the Gardening with Natives page on the CNPS Milo Baker chapter website, which is Milo Baker chapter is the Sonoma County. Great. All right. Well, there are multiple people saying thank you and how wonderful this was. And I think at this point, unless anyone else has something, at this point, you can also feel free to just unmute yourself. But I think I will wrap up. And maybe Stephen, you can stay on the call with me so that we can get those resources sorted out.
Okay, sounds good. And thank you guys all for hanging in with me. I know I ran a little over an hour. I was really trying to get it under an hour, but I didn't quite make it.
Oh, we do have one more last minute question. Several native plant tours available this time of year. Oh, it was a comment just saying folks can go on native plant tours this time of year. That's a good point. There is the Waterwise garden tour coming up. And also CNPS is involved with that. So maybe I can send that link out too with the resources. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. We hope to see you at another event on one of our preserves or virtually soon. Take care.
Thanks so much. This was excellent.